Hello, I'm here with my cat Walter on St. Patrick's Day for today's video. Walter's not too happy about it, but we'll see if he sticks around. Today, for Sunday Sit Down, I'm going to chat about a topic that kind of merges a few different lists that you have requested. People have requested a list about top 10 like gateway games, top 10 family-friendly games, top 10 games for non-gamers. And I've kind of mashed them all together into a new category, which I'm calling Modern Classics. My top 10 favorite modern classics. And this is going to be somewhat of a subjective category. What I've done is I've tried to determine, through some guidelines that I'll mention, what I consider a modern classic to be. And then I've taken the 10 that I've culled from this list, this much greater list, I'll mention the honorable mentions, and then ranked those top 10, not in terms of how modern or how classic they are, but in terms of how much I enjoy them. So it's kind of a split list here in how I did this. The category, or the kind of categories that I use to help determine what I consider a modern classic. There are a few different things. One is I did decide that the game did need to be both a gateway game and a family-friendly game. And that's fairly subjective. I think we could argue that in the comments if you want, but it just kind of felt right for that to be in the modern classic category. And that is despite the fact that some of the other categories that I'll mention, there are some games that are not gateway or family-friendly that could have fit into this list. And maybe I'll do a separate list on them sometime. But some of the other things that I wanted to consider for a modern classic, a big part of it is that there be a critical mass of people who have played the game, who continue to play the game, and have bought the game in the first place. And so this is kind of me looking for quantitative ways for me to measure like what actually a modern classic is, because I know what we play in my group, but that might be very different than what you play in your group, or what someone who maybe owns a few games, what they might play in their group. So I didn't want to have it depend too much on my experiences and have some data behind it. So I looked at two different places. There's someone, I think her name is Sharon or Shannon on Board Game Geek, who maintains a list of the most played games each month. So she looks at how many people have logged plays of each game per month, and she creates a ranking of them. And I looked at the first page of that ranking for different months for the last 5 years. That's what I considered modern, the last 5 years. And I looked at the top 25, and I try to find patterns. If there are definitely games that appeared on there like once, and there are games that appeared there on every list pretty much for the last 5 years. So that was one quantitative category. The other category is I looked at ICV2.com, and I looked at they monitor sales from retailers. So I looked at best-selling games over the last few years to see how that correlated. I think I went a little bit more by the BGG plays list to determine what an evergreen game actually is, what people are actually continuing to play over and over again, versus the ICV2 list, but that did influence a little bit. And the games that I mentioned that kind of got knocked out after I looked at those categories, or after I determined that gateway and family-friendly would be in there, but would have otherwise been in there, are Castles of Burgundy, which really surprised me. That game, I definitely enjoy that game, but I had no idea that people were playing it as often as they are in terms of how they've logged their plays on Board Game Geek, which I know even that's skewed data. A lot of people, I don't log my plays on Board Game Geek. I'm sure plenty of people do not, and probably the type of person who does log their plays on BGG might be a specific type of person. Maybe, I don't know. But Castles of Burgundy, on there a ton, pretty much every list. Roll for the Galaxy. I had no idea so many people were playing that either. That's definitely on there. We haven't played that in my group in years. Dead of Winter, another one. We haven't played that in my group in years, but a ton of people have played that. I think it's kind of fallen off maybe in the last year in terms of most played, but for years it was on that most played list every month for quite some time. Pandemic Legacy Season 1 kind of came in, I think that was maybe 2015. It came in, I think it's fallen off a little bit, but for many months it was on there and the most played. And then more recently, My Game Scythe and Terraforming Mars both have been on that list for quite some time. Gloomhaven has definitely gotten up there, but it's a little bit newer. I think if we look at Gloomhaven in a few years, it probably will still also be there. But all those games I wanted to mention because I don't really consider them gateway games. They're maybe Roll for the Galaxy is Gateway Plus, Castles of Burgundy maybe Gateway Plus. Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is probably the closest because as you can probably guess, Pandemic will be on this list today. But those are the ones that didn't qualify. I'll just run down some other ones real quick. I won't even talk about why, because this will get too long. Although I do want to call out two in particular that came real close to making it. Settlers of Catan, which is probably should be on this list, but in terms of logged plays on Board Game Geek, is almost non-existent in terms of the last few years. It's barely on there. So I think that's more of a symptom of hobby gamers who log plays on that list versus the number of people who actually are playing Catan on a weekly basis, which I'm sure is many, many people. But that isn't going to make the list. Love Letter was the one that pretty much met all of these qualifications, but I had to cut one because I had 11, and so I had to cut one. So Love Letter just barely didn't make it. Hanabi probably could have made it. Star Realms probably could have made it. And again, these are not making it because of quality. These are not making it because they didn't quite meet the qualifications as much as these games that did make the list. But they're real close. Hanabi hasn't seen quite as few plays according to Board Game Geek over the last few years. So Hanabi, Star Realms, The Resistance, which I actually thought would appear more often, but is not on that list, that most played list for a while now. Sushi Go comes often on that list. Machi, Koro, and then some modern games that really I think I'll do another list like this in a few years, and I bet these games will be on the list. Those are Azul, which just kind of screams modern classic when you play Azul. Sagrada, The Mind, and Kingdomino. Kingdomino is probably the one that I wouldn't put on the list, but apparently a lot of people are playing it. And ones that weren't on that most played list, at least the top 25, that I thought should have been, and not should have been, but I was surprised that they weren't on there, were Tokaido, Mysterium, Downforce, Telestrations, and Qwirkle. I kind of thought they might have been on there. Maybe they're deeper down on the list and I didn't see them, but not in the top 25 of most played. So anyway, let's get on to the top 10. So this is, again, the games that most meet these qualifications, and now we're bringing in my opinions. This is the first start where my opinions really come in here in terms of how much I enjoy these games that I thought should have been on the top 10 list in terms of what makes a modern classic game. Number 10 is King of Tokyo. Many of these games I have owned in the past, and many of them I do not own now. So I think that's a kind of a testament to what a gateway game is. I'm always happy to play the games on these lists, but and I played them a lot when I got them, and now they've moved on off the list, and I've kind of replaced them with other similar games, like Dominion. I'll get to Dominion in a second, but King of Tokyo. And one of the things I'm going to do today, let's get to the design part. When I talk about these games, I'm going to mention a little highlight, because there are some key commonalities between all these games. If you are thinking about trying to design one of these modern classics, you might want to think about these things. King of Tokyo is the game on the list that, like almost all these games, feature a form of interaction between players. All of them do. Most of them are passive interactions, and when there are direct interactions, like with King of Tokyo, it's typically not you choosing to target a specific player, but rather you're targeting something that the game tells you to target. I'll mention another example in a bit, but King of Tokyo is a great example of that. If you have your character in the middle of the city in King of Tokyo, you are kind of opting into getting beat up on for a little bit, because when you deal damage to everyone, not just yourself. So you're not saying, okay, I'm going to target this specific player. The game is telling you who you are or are not targeting. So I think this is a classic example of many of these. You'll see there is that form of, or that type of player interaction where it is actually, it's both passive and fairly direct, but not targeted. I guess that's the key. You're not targeting specific players. That's King of Tokyo number 10. Number 9 is Pandemic. Pandemic is the only cooperative game on this list. I found that kind of interesting that it was the only cooperative game on this list. There are a few that I mentioned, the honorable mentions that are cooperative, but the rest of these are competitive games. So maybe that says something about the types of games that have the potential to be evergreen and modern classics. Number 8 is, where's my number 8? There it is. Codenames. Codenames is the only team game on the list. All the other ones are... Codenames I consider competitive, but in the subcategory of team games, it is the only team game on the list. It's also the only party-style game on the list. I think Telestrations has sold many, many, many copies and could have been on this list, but it just didn't meet some of the qualifications. But Codenames is on the list. I don't think I have anything very specific to say about Codenames. Although I'll highlight this for Codenames. Most of the games on this list, in fact, all of them, cost $50 or less, and Codenames I think is around $20. So I think that that might be, if you're trying to figure out what components to put in the game, you might think about that price range of hitting that range between maybe 20 and 50. 50 at most. 50 is at the high end. I would go between 20 and 40 if you want to target that evergreen modern classic category for your game design. Number 7 is Dominion. And Dominion obviously has spawned many deck building games afterwards. There might have been some deck building games before that, but I think Dominion is kind of the classic example of a deck builder. And I'll use Dominion as an example because I often talk about on this channel how I try to design games without rounds because I want to keep players immersed. I want one turn to flow into the next. I take a turn, you take a turn, you take a turn, you take a turn, and so on until the game ends. So the game isn't determined, the game length isn't determined by a set number of rounds, and it creates this nice flow in the game. 8 out of the 10 games on this list, including Dominion, do not have rounds. They have that flow of play that allows you to immerse yourself in the game and take turn after turn after turn. So that is a very specific design thing that you might consider if you are trying to design a modern classic game. Get rid of the concept of rounds. Just focus on having players each take short, simple turns, one after another, until the game ends. That is Dominion number 7. Number 6 on the list is Splendor. Splendor is one actually that surprised me to be on the list a little bit because it's kind of been off my radar for a while. It was probably on one of my top 10s for a while. I really enjoyed Splendor. I enjoy the engine building aspect of it, how you're getting better and better at something throughout the game. Many of these games have engine building aspects to them. You're getting better at things as you are playing. And that would be the thing I'd say about Splendor particularly. It's kind of defined, it's engine building at its core. We're in the top 5 now. Okay, Ticket to Ride. Ticket to Ride. The thing I'll mention about Ticket to Ride that is exemplified by many of these games is the length of the game. And this is somewhat what defines a gateway game as well, that the length is usually around like 30 to 45 minutes. I think there's only one game that pushes beyond that on the high end. And some of these games can run long depending on your players. But Ticket to Ride, I think it usually runs 45 to 60 minutes at most. And so I think that length of time is pretty key for a modern classic game, according to this list at least. Carcassonne is next. I actually had a strong desire to play Carcassonne fairly recently, and I got it to the table after not playing it for a while. And I was reminded of how elegant of a game it is, but how many interesting decisions there are. There is player interaction, but I have so many options that I even if someone takes the thing I wanted, I still have a ton of options to take. And the thing I mentioned about Carcassonne that goes hand in hand with many of these games is that most of these games use the victory point method of scoring, in that you're not racing to do a certain thing. You might be racing to end the game, but you are trying to add up victory points during the game and at the end of the game to determine the winner. 7.5 out of the 10 games on this list do this. The 0.5 is King of Tokyo, because you can win in King of Tokyo by eliminating all the other players, but you can also win by scoring a certain number of points to win, to trigger the end game and win. So most of the games on this list, you add up victory points at the end of the game. King of Tokyo isn't a good example of that either. So I'll say 7 out of 10 of the games use victory point scoring methods. The next one, that was Carcassonne. Number 3 is Lords of Waterdeep, which I think is actually the only worker placement game on this list. That's interesting. I just realized that. Yeah, Lords of Waterdeep. Lords of Waterdeep is also somewhat the exception to many of these rules. It is the heaviest of these games. It is the longest of these games. It is the most expensive of these games. But it met all of my categories. So I thought it did deserve to go on this list. And it's one that I happen to really, really enjoy. Yeah, I don't think that, because it's kind of the exception to many of these rules, I won't go into them rule by rule. Number 2 is Seven Wonders and Seven Wonders Duel. Seven Wonders Duel has been on this list quite a bit over the last few years, but I've noticed that even though Seven Wonders was on like the most played games list, it didn't knock Seven Wonders off the list. Both Seven Wonders and Seven Wonders Duel are on the list. Both are drafting games in slightly different ways. I really love Duel. I actually have Duel right here. I don't have many of these games, but I do have Duel, and really enjoy Duel quite a bit, as well as Seven Wonders. I think Seven Wonders can have a little bit of a learning curve for people who are trying to play for the first time, because they you're giving them like new rules every round to understand the next set of cards. But once you play that first time, it's fine. And that's one thing I wanted to mention here, accessibility, which actually this is not probably the example that I would use for accessibility, but many of these games are just very accessible in terms of how easy they are to learn, how easy they are to just start taking turns, so that you're not sitting through a long rules explanation. And they often, most of these has very simple, streamlined rule sets in the first place. And let's start with I've been talking about like the exceptions as I've gotten to these games. And I'll do that for the last one because my number one is Patchwork. I really, really love Patchwork. It probably could be interchangeable with Seven Wonders Duel or even Lords of Waterdeep, but I really love these games and I really do love Patchwork. Patchwork is the only two-player game on this list, and 6 out of the 10 games play greater than 4 players. So that one, I don't know if I'd strictly go by that category if you're trying to design a modern classic game, but you might consider having it play up to 5 or 6 players if possible, because that does seem to fit this category a little bit more than games that only play 2, 3, 4 players. So I think I've hit all those categories: the price, the accessibility, the length of the game, the player count, the lack of the rounds, that most of them are competitive, but there is some direct interaction, but it's not targeted interaction, and that many of these use the victory point method of scoring. That seems to be, those seem to be some commonalities between these modern classic games, and that is my top 10. I'd love to hear your top 10. I've mentioned a lot of games here today. You might feel free to apply to mention any of the games that I mentioned as in terms of what you consider your modern classics, however you might categorize that. And if you have some games like I mentioned, Azul, Sagrada, The Mind, Downforce, if you think there are some games like that have come out fairly recently, but in 5 years will be considered modern classics per the categories that I mentioned here, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that as well. And if you have any design thoughts or questions, I'd love to discuss that as well in the comments. All right, this has been my Sunday sit down, and I will see you later this week for some of my favorite game mechanism videos. Take care.